Everybody got their ears on. All right, so Mike is a senior mining consultant at Stantec Engineering. He previously taught mining engineering at the University of Utah and worked in the mining industry for Kennecott Copper. We got that in common. I used to work out there too. Consolidation Coal and IMCO Process Equipment Company. Mike's dad grew up on Ontario Avenue in Park City and worked at the Silver King mine while he attended college. His grandfather worked in the Park City mines for over 30 years whenever he wasn't laid off or on strike. Zula Nelson is Mike Nelson's grandmother. Without further ado, Mike, please take the microphone.
So first, I'd like to just acknowledge some people that came with me tonight. My wife Judy came, and I always appreciate her support. And my Aunt Sherry came. She's my auntie, but she's just 2 years older than I am. And she was a delightful surprise to my grandparents when she was born. At least for a day, right, Sherry? At least for a day, yeah. So she spent her first years in that little house up on Ontario Ridge. But my grandmother was named by her father, Zula Floyd Gordon. She hated that name. She told me that's a terrible thing to call a little girl. As she got older, she let it be known that her name was Z-U, and that was better. But we're going to be talking about her tonight. Her ancestors, the Gordons, were from Virginia, and her great-grandfather, Eli Gordon, was in the Confederate Army in the Civil War and got sent to the Union prison in Andersonville, Indiana, which, from everything I've read, was a place you did not want to go. And somehow he escaped it. We've had a hard time tracing him, but he ended up on the Provo bench around down there in Utah County, or sometimes up here in what would it be, eastern Wasatch County, Daniels, and so on. Is that better? Oh, yeah. Thank you. Okay. That's what it's for, right? So my grandmother's father, James Gordon, left the Provo bench and went to work in the Park City mines. They were paying sometimes $2 or $3 a day then, and that was good money. The unfortunate thing is you can see James' family there with 5 children, and the little baby, Joe, his mother died 5 days after he was delivered. And they said it was childbed fever. I think that's what they called blood poisoning then, just from the conditions. So there's a young man with 5 children, and he has to work to support them. All right. And Grandma said, yeah, I got farmed out a lot. All right. Just whoever could take her in, and so on. And that was the case for the next 7 or 8 years. And James continued working in the mine, had a house in Charleston, but the kids just went where they could go. One place a lot of these kids went, and a lot of other people did, was to stay with Aunt Mary. And I'm going to tell you something now that's confusing, but you have to believe me. First off, Carl and Zula were first cousins once removed. Okay, and the common saying over in Daniel and Charleston and so on was that the Nelsons marry the Gordons marry the Orgills, and the Orgills marry the Nelsons. Okay, and it seemed to work okay. So that's how my grandparents ended up being first cousins once removed. But Aunt Mary and her husband didn't have any children. They were unable to, so she would take in almost anybody and take care of them. They did adopt a baby. You can see in that picture, that's their daughter, Stella. And on the other side, on the Aunt Mary's left, you see Zula. And somehow, even when she was a farmed out kid where nobody had any money, she managed to look glamorous. And I don't know where she got that fur, but she put to it. So one reason the Orgills did well is that my dad said they had the best land in Daniel. They could raise enough hay to feed 2 or 3 cows. And if you had cows that you could feed, that meant you had steady income, right? Which was different than working in the mines. So you can see Uncle Tom there, and he made his way like that. Zoo didn't stay in one place. I've kind of highlighted here, but she spent some time down in Linden, which is in Utah County, living with relatives there. She was really proud that she finished junior high there. That was a big thing, right? And a lot of women, that was as far as they went in schooling. Because why do you need any more education than that, right? That was the attitude. She worked here at Keeley's Soda Fountain. She also worked in a railroad boarding house. And when I was talking to her about that, I knew a little bit about railroad boarding houses. And I said, was that a good place for an 11-year-old girl to work? And she said, you know, those men treated me so nicely. He said, they were rough men. They smoked cigarettes and marijuana, and they drank, and they played cards and carried on, but they treated me nicely, which I thought was interesting. Said the thing she regretted about working in the boarding house was that the lady who owned it, Mrs. Irvine, taught her how to smoke cigarettes. And it took her a long time to get over that hobby. And some of you may have experienced it. Sorry? I'm not sure. Yeah, that's right. That was the coal mines that had canaries. So there was a time when my dad spent a long time with his mom. My dad spent that. Wow, that's a very directional mic. Thank you. My dad spent quite a long time with his mom, getting her to tell him about her life. And wherever it's appropriate in this presentation, I'm just going to be reading from her words because that gives you more feeling what she's like. So, relative to this slide, she said, when I was 12 years old, I went to Salt Lake and lived with Rose Widsoe. She was the wife of John Peter Widsoe, who was a brother of John A. Widsoe. Widsoe was a Mormon apostle, and he was a convert from Norway, but he was the first Mormon leader to get a PhD from an Eastern university. So he had a lot of stature in the community. He was the president of the Utah State Agricultural College for a long time. His brother was an administrator at the University of Utah, and his brother's wife, his brother died young, but what was his name again? Sorry, John Peter's wife lived for a long time and was the chair of the what they called the Family Development Department there at the University of Utah. Zula says, I lived in her house and took care of her sister's children who were visiting from Alameda, California. At the end of the summer, they asked me to go with them, keep taking care of the girls, and they said they would pay all my expenses and even pay for me to go to high school. And then she said, of course, Dad wouldn't think of it. And, in later years, she said, I've often wondered what had happened if I'd gone to California. And of course, C.S. Lewis said, no one can know what might have been. So Zula goes on to talk about her life at this time. And she said, Carl Nelson visited often at Aunt Mary's house when I was staying there. He liked to come there because Mary always fed him and everyone was nice. He said, I can remember he teased me a lot. He would make me hang by my fingers from the door jamb, and just as I was about to fall, he would catch me and throw me up to the ceiling and catch me again. He rubbed my face with his whiskers. I guess I must have liked all of his pranks because I was always happy when he came around, and he always had a little packet of sen-sen in his pocket. Now, why did Carl have sen-sen? Aunt Mary was a really faithful Mormon, and he didn't want to come into her house smelling of tobacco. Okay. So Zoo goes on to say, I went to a dance at the Jordanelle. Now, at this time, the Jordanelle was not a reservoir. Anybody know what it was? It was a big dance hall, right, between Heber and Park City, and it was on the Provo River. It was named after the Jordan family that had homesteaded that land. So she says, I was at Uncle Tom's and Aunt Mary's, and I'd gone to a dance that night with Keith, a boy from Daniels Creek, and with Carl's sister, Minnie. I wasn't too fond of the boy I'd gone with. I guess I was a stinker because I thought, if I meet somebody I like, I'll ditch Keith and go home with him. Does that sound like Grandma? Yep. Anyway, I was dancing and having a real good time when Minnie and Carl came along. So, of course, I danced with Carl, and I told him I wasn't too fond of the boy I'd come with, and I was sure he would be happy to take me home. He just laughed at me and said he guessed I'd have to get home the way I came. Then he introduced me to the friend who was with him, a really nice fellow, and we danced several times. He was neat and lots of fun. But the only catch is he was riding with Carl, so I couldn't ask him to take me home. We made a date, Carl and I did, for the next night, and he took me to a dance at Camp Kilcare, and I couldn't find out what that was. I don't know if it was a typo or what, but it was up what would be north of Camas, up the canyon up there. Woodlands? Yeah. Okay, thank you. And anyway, he said, yeah, like this, right? Okay. Of course, we had lots of fun. The next day was Saturday, as I remember, and I was on my hands and knees scrubbing Aunt Mary's kitchen floor. How many have scrubbed the kitchen floor on your hands and knees? How many have grandkids that have done that? I don't. Okay. But it was hot and messy. I heard a car stop outside, then suddenly there stood Carl with a big grin on his face. Of course, I blushed and got even hotter. I think I would have stuttered if I'd tried to talk. But anyway, he said, "Let your Aunt Stella finish the floor and let's you and I go for a ride." So he pulled me up off the floor, as messy as I was, and took me to the car and drove away. That was our first date. Okay, let me see here. Got too many papers. So his car was a 1927 Model T Coupe, green. This has been fixed up, right? What's that? Oh, sorry. Where? Oh, we got a rat there now? I don't know why that picture of the I'm sorry that picture's not showing. And anyway, we'll leave it on that blank till the rats come up, okay? He What's that? Yeah. Okay. Okay, it's showing up on my screen. All right. Thank you. It is green, okay? Um Carl was working in Park City at the Ontario mine, so he had some money. He lived with his sister Elfie, and whenever we were in Park, we were in it. Whenever we were home, we were at Aunt Mary's or Aunt Elfie's. Then on July 9th, 1927, we took his sister Minnie and went to Provo and were married by a justice of the peace. We took Aunt Minnie back to Heber, went to Salt Lake, and stayed one night in the New House Hotel. We didn't have a reception or a party of any kind. We then went back to Park City, moved in with Aunt Elfie, and Carl went back to work. Housing was really tight in Park City at that time, and they finally found an apartment where they could stay, and it had 2 extra bedrooms, which they sublet to single miners who were typical young single miners. It was a good deal for them financially. They had to share a kitchen and a bathroom with these 2 guys, but the thing was not a good deal was that these were typical miners jokers, and they were always playing jokes on Grandma Zoo. She says, "One of the jokes that just about did me in was when I opened Dad's lunch bucket, a huge rat jumped out and ran around the kitchen. Some joker had put it in there. Dad was asleep. He was on graveyard shift, but my screams awakened him, and he took care of the rat. He told those fellows in no uncertain terms they better never do that again." They believed him, but another time they put a pair of ladies' panties in his lunch bucket. When I opened the bucket, I didn't know what to say, but Dad was very good. He told me, I told him I knew he'd never do anything like that, and he gave me a hug, and it was just a joke. So, having worked in the mines, I've seen those kinds of jokes of putting stuff in people's lunch boxes. Or if there's a nice dessert in there and it's left in the control room, then you can take the good stuff out of the lunchbox, right? Okay. So when at this time Carl was working at the Ontario, he was on a job they called top car, and top car, the guy stood outside on the dumps that came out of the mine, either ore or waste. And as these little mine cars came out, the guy would grab it, disconnect it from whatever, and dump it. You can see there's a lever on the side of that car that you decrease that, or you release that, then you could pull up on the handle on the back and it would dump out the front. And so after you dump the car, then you'd put it back so it could go into the mine again. It's the kind of job that you didn't have to think much, right? You didn't have to go underground. You got to be outside all day, and there was very little risk, okay? And one man could do it. So there are usually 2 or 3 top car guys on the dumps at one of these mines. Now, when they got married, Zoo was only 17, okay? And the first year they were married, they had a little boy named Thomas, who's my dad. The next year, they had another boy, Carl. And so things were busy, right? And especially for a woman whose husband's working shifts, right? And take care of those little guys. That job was good, though. It paid well and it was steady, but the Depression came along. And finally, in 1931, the Ontario was closed. All the men were laid off. Carl had to do what he called rustle up work, right? That meant go everywhere and look for a job and hope you find one. So sometimes there'd be a need for somebody to go in and do some maintenance on a pump or something in one of the mines. Sometimes there were other tasks, right? But he had to stay and rustle work. Some of his rustling of work also consisted of going trapping, which he'd done as a young man. Oops. Finally, though, it got to be just too much. I Googled a picture of discouraged miners, and this is what I got. So, but they sold out in Park City and bought a chicken farm on the Provo bench, thinking that they could have a lot of chickens, get eggs, and sell them and make money. Zula moved there to the farm with her 2 little boys, and Carl was back and forth. But by 1932, Zula had to be back and forth as well because her dad was dying of miner's pneumoconiosis or silicosis. And so he had to stay sitting up or he would choke. So somebody had to sit by him all night when he fell asleep and make sure he didn't drop his head or whatever. So it was a difficult time. And in 1932, they had another child, Lila, who's a lovely girl. But their family was growing and the wolf was at the door. So taking care of these chickens was really something. When you have a building full of baby chicks, you have to keep it warm. Okay? And the way they did that in this farm was build a fire in a big fire pit in the floor in the middle of the coop. Somebody had to do that. Somebody had to feed him every day. And Carl was back and forth, so a lot of that work went to Zula. Now, they applied for government assistance that came out later on in the Depression, but the appraiser put a value on all the chickens they had, which made them too wealthy to get government assistance. And there was one good time when the government financed putting a water line along the Provo bench to serve the 8 families that lived there, and all the men were paid cash to do that. Carl was in and out a lot still. There was always hunting. He was good at that, and I like this picture because it looks like those guys had a good time hunting. And we're not sure who the other guy is, but you can see the dog and the horses. And Carl did quite a bit of trapping during this time because his brother, who lived, I think, in American Fork, was trapping for the Bureau of Reclamation. And the Bureau of Reclamation would pay 25 cents, is what I remember, for 2 ears and a tail from a coyote. Okay? So they would trap coyotes and make some money that way. So it was a hard time there on the Provo bench, but there were a couple of stories that just really amused me. First one was my dad said, I think all the families on the bench had a car, but we only had one license plate because you had to buy the license plate. Sounds like somebody's had this experience. So if you need to go in town, you had to find out who used the license plate last and put it on your car. Carl always liked to wear a hat when he was outside, and he had lost his hat from somewhere. He was checking traps. They were at the store in American Fork, and Zula was just choosing the groceries carefully, to make sure they had the money. And Carl told me, he says, I sidled up and down those aisles, and finally I just put a hat on my head and walked out. He said, he'd always say, your grandma came out of the car and she took one look at me and said, Carl, that's the ugliest hat I've ever seen. You get in there and take it back right now and get your money back. So he said, I went in and I meandered around those aisles till I thought nobody was looking, and I put that hat back on the shelf. So that's a good story. Now, this slide doesn't have Carl or Zula in it, but I put it in to just let you see what it was like to be a trapper. Mostly, these guys went trapping in the winter, especially if they were trapping beaver or other fur-bearing animals. But that meant that they spent a lot of winters living in a tent. Any volunteers? No. Okay. It looked like a hard life. On the right is Carl's dad, Wilford Nelson, called Whiff, and in front of the tent is his brother Jaime. And we couldn't figure out who the third guy is, could we, Sherry? It's a cousin. There were lots of cousins around. Yeah. So, I talked, and I talked to my grandpa. I said, so what did you take with you when you went trapping? He said, well, we took a bag of beans, a bag of flour, a bag of coffee. And he said, and yeah, a couple of sides of bacon. He said, but mostly we lived on that. And then there was always some animal you could eat. I said, did you eat beaver? He said, oh yeah, beaver's good. Okay. So I guess anything's good. This just, that's bad, right? And these are the kind of traps they use because they work. But that, those kind of traps are illegal now and people don't use them much. But it's good to remember, where everything came from and still does. So 1937, 42, things got better, right? Someone that was acquainted with the Nelson family, trying to think, it was the Swansons, I think. Their man knew the superintendent of the Daily Judge mine, and he told Carl through Mr. Swanson that he had a summer job for him mucking in the mines. Mucking means shoveling, right? And he was hired as a mucker for the summer at the Daily Judge. He told me this while he was still alive. It was the first regular work he's had in 5 years, which you can't imagine that. I can't. And also they paid $5 a day, which to him was just amazing. And it sounds like, shoveling ore, that might be a good job, right? It wasn't really. This job doesn't look too bad. You can see some drillers setting up there, and the young guys mucking. Looks pretty easy. But remember, if that's ore, each shovelful weighs about 45 pounds, right? Because it's galena, and it's sulfides. So, and they liked you to try and do 2 shovels full every minute, right? Just kind of keep track of it in your head. So the next pictures I'm going to show you, this is a little departure. There was a man in Salt Lake, Buck O'Donnell, who ran a company called Centennial Development. I don't know if anybody remembers that, but they specialized in shaft sinking and getting the mine ready and so on. And he loved to draw. So on your right, you see the man down on the floor is mucking out the round, right? They've just blasted, in that big pile of rock there. It's going to be loaded into those cars and hauled out of the mine. Now, the driller is already up on the muck pile and drilling the holes for the next round. And if they did it that way, they didn't have to carry a ladder around to drill those holes, right? So that's how it worked. But you'll notice there's some big rocks there, and he's having to bend down and so on. The other thing that muckers were responsible for was they called it barring down the back, all right? the back is the roof of the mine, and there was always loose rock up there from the blasting. Sometimes it was big, sometimes it was little, but the mucker had to take that an 8 or 10-foot bar that had a chisel tip on the end of it and try and knock those rocks down. And you can see in the picture, Buck depicts the danger of being a mucker. You can see that one rock kind of looks like a devil there, right? Okay. And, it was a hazardous job and it was hard work. So when they came back to Park, the first place they lived was on Park Avenue, across from. They say it was across from the alley on the other side of the Miners Union Hall. I'm not familiar enough to know exactly where that was, but this is that's the Miners Union Hall. And my dad said it was hard for the kids because the only place they could play was in Park Avenue, and that was a busy street. And if they went up the hill, it was too steep, and if they went the other way, there were all those miners in there who were working afternoon or graveyard shift, and the kids were too noisy. And then there was Mrs. O'Hagan. He said when they moved in, the other kids came over and said, "Don't go close to Mrs. O'Hagan's yard. She'll yell at you." And apparently one time they hit their ball inside her yard and she wouldn't give it back to them. My dad went in and told his mom, and he said, "Your grandma marched right over there." She said, "I'm going to make friends with that woman." And she did. And if you knew her, you wouldn't be surprised. But and she got the ball back. So have we got the house with the people in front of it now? Yeah. Okay. So I keep trying to put this mic in the right place. I'm sorry if I'm not doing it. They left the house down on Park Avenue and bought a house on Prospect Avenue, also called the Ontario Ridge, right? And it's interesting. They lived there for years, and this is the only photo I could find of it. You might have another one, Sherry. I don't know. But it was a frame house, right? It didn't have a foundation, just had 4 big flat slabs of red sandstone that the house sat on. There were 2 bedrooms, and this is Zula speaking again, a kitchen, dining room, living room, and bath. There was a cellar underneath the kitchen floor. It was just a hole under part of the kitchen, but had a dirt floor, dirt walls, and it kept a nice, even, cool temperature all year. It was a good place to store fruit and vegetables. You got in it through a trap door in the middle of the kitchen. There was a shed that joined onto the back bedroom, and this is where we kept extra junk and the coal and the wood. My dad told me they usually burned in the winter about a ton of coal every month to keep warm. No insulation in the house, of course, right? So, and just think of loading that much coal in and out of your coal stove every year. Oops. I'm going the wrong way now. There. One more. The back bedroom was where Kay and Tom slept, and they had a double bed. In the winter, they were glad for it because they'd hug each other's back to keep warm. The bedroom was far removed from the stove or the heater, and oftentimes the boys would heat up rocks before they went to bed, and so they could stand on those till they got under the covers. So again, interesting place to live. Most of the miners were working during the 1937 to 42 time, but it was rough for a number of reasons. Metal prices were unpredictable as the war ended. They went up and down, but also the mines were getting deeper. And as a general rule, if you get deeper, you get wetter, right? And they had a lot of pumping to do and a lot of maintenance on pumps. And there were also, though, unpredictable layoffs. And there was a union at the time, but they hadn't really fought for rights. And so it was not unusual for a man to go to work at the mines, be told that, "Sorry, no work today, go on home. Come back tomorrow and we'll see if we can hire you." And that's hard to work under those circumstances. Some of you may have seen this in another presentation I did. This is the office building at the Daily Judge Mine. But I took my dad there when we were working on it, and he said, "I remember coming there with your dad and Uncle Farley." He said they let it be known they were going to hire 3 men. We got up there, and there was about 50 men lined up in front of that door on the right, which was the super's office. He said each man would have to walk up, look straight at the super, throw his shoulders back, and he'd get a nod to the right if he was hired and a nod to the left if he wasn't. So that's effective management, right? So, and all they were interested in was somebody to do the work. My dad also remembered going over, he said, to the other side of Deer Valley where some men had sunk a shaft and abandoned it, and they'd left a drill down in there. We decided to get it out. So they rented an air tugger. That's what you see there. It's a thing that winds up a wire rope. You have to have an air compressor to run it. They set it up at that shaft, and then they took the cable out and rigged it so that there was a pick handle went across the cable like a T. And they could put the cable between their legs and sit on that pick handle and go down, and then they hooked up the drill and brought it up to the surface. He said, we got $20 for that drill. Okay. When you think, well, if the miner's making $5 a day, $20 is pretty significant. So this was also, as I'm sure you realize, a time of war and stress nationwide. A lot of the Nelson and Gordon and Orgill relatives were in the military. And when I read Zoo's reminiscences, it seems like about half of them were always staying with her. And she loved to feed them and take care of them. The last quote I have from her just, I thought, gave a lot of insight. I shouldn't put these papers away. Here we go. So we bottled 300 or 400 quarts of cherries, apricots, peaches, pears, tomatoes, string beans, and all kinds of jams and jellies. We were really lucky Dad would get a deer or two, and we would bottle that too. How do you bottle a deer? Pressure cooker is how they did it, right? You know. And also, I've seen my other grandma used to put a whole chicken in a 2-quart jar in the pressure cooker, and put it that way, and it was still edible and good food in the winter. Anyway, I taught my kids how to work as a team. One washing bottles, the other helping to peel the fruit, another filling the bottles and putting in the sugar. Everybody helped because everybody knew that next winter Dad might be out of work and we'd need food to eat. When my dad read this, he said, "She didn't call it the law of the harvest, but she taught us what that meant." So I think that's all the readings I have now just to finish up here. Sorry, thank you. My wife keeps going. But she's not making obscene gestures, I can assure you. So during that time, they lived in the same spot for a long time. And Zoo said she really enjoyed that because she got to know her neighbors and was familiar with them. And she actually made 3 strong connections during the time they lived in Park in the 40s and 50s. First was with their neighbors. She said the Rosses and Thompsons and Grosses and I and they and Carl and I used to go dancing every Saturday when the men were not working. And we'd often finish off with a midnight supper on the way home. I think Thompson is Tommy Thompson. If you're familiar with his name, he wrote some books about Park City years ago. Anyway, the second group that she formed a strong bond with was the Ladies Auxiliary of the Miners Union. She really identified with that. And the third group that they identified with and enjoyed was the Mormon Church, which is interesting because everybody where they lived over in Daniel and Charleston, it was all Mormon settlers, and that's what they had been too, but it had just never caught on with them, So to find out more about the Ladies Auxiliary, I went through the park record for 14 years or so and just searched for Ladies Auxiliary and so on. And it was amazing what these women did. I made a list of it. You've probably read most of it by now. But they sponsored dances. They sponsored recreational stuff for the kids after school. They got the city fathers to put in street lights on Park Avenue. They were serious. And they got things done. And they all marched in and supported the Labor Day parade. And this was a big event in Park City. I think Sherry still remembers some of them, even into the 50s. But you can see these miners here. They're not in their mine clothes, are they? It's a serious occasion. They're dressed up. They got their ribbons on. And it looks like there aren't many of them, but look how far that line goes down Main Street. You know. So the ladies' auxiliary would always march in the Labor Day parade, and they would practice 3 times a week, year round, to make sure that they were good marchers. And they had matching satin shirts or blouses, and they were very proud of what they'd done. You can see Zula there, just her head's right underneath the flag. You see she's looking off to the left. What? I wonder if I can. Right there. Right. Under the flag. I don't know if you can see my cursor or not. But anyway, when I was looking at this picture with her, I said, "Oh, you're looking into the distance." And she said, "My right side's my best side." It's interesting to me how much personality is betrayed in a statement like that. The other thing that was really interesting, this clip doesn't relate to much of anything, but it says that the local number 99 have been busy the past week with the general house cleaning of the Union Hall. The men would appreciate any help the ladies of auxiliary number 43 could give them. If you are not too busy, come out and spend an hour or two helping the men any afternoon. So I thought that was amusing. We'll kind of almost finish up with just a discussion of Labor Day here. The union sponsored the Labor Day celebrations, and it was always publicized in the park record. That's a small thing there, but they had events, they had races, they had hammer and nail driving contests, and so on. I've just highlighted a few of these. So you'll notice parade at 9:30. This is down at the bottom. Children form at the Union Pacific Depot. Each child under 12 years of age receives a dime and a ticket to the matinee. Okay. What could you do with a dime in 1944? A lot. You could buy 2 Hershey bars. I know that. Okay. So that was an interesting one. The other one was there were 3 races for the ladies. This is not a joke. Okay. So it was the ladies over 25, the fat ladies over 200 pounds. And then the ladies had a sawing and nail driving contest with a note to bring your own hammer and saw. Okay. But if you went and looked carefully at the list, whoever won these events get $3. Okay. And again, $3, that was a lot of money. So the other thing that was interesting, this is back to the 1945 parade. And I think the good thing here, we'll get right down to the bottom. It says, near the end, it says boxing, wrestling, and vaudeville. And that fine print under there says a 2-hour show. This show is being done by professionals, which makes you think maybe they hadn't had very good attendance at a previous vaudeville show. So now the third thing that my grandparents got interested in as they got older and more established was going to the Mormon church. And this is the church in Park City. I think it was built in 1887 and was used till 1962 or so. Right, and there were a lot of people there. I think that building still stands. I'm not sure. Some of you recognize it? It's probably a boarding house now or something. But anyway, my research tells me that the first Mormons who came to Park City were not really welcomed, which, different culture and everything. But after the big fire, everyone had to work together, and there were a lot of bonds formed during that time. Carl and Zula started going to church, and they really enjoyed it. Carl was always interested in learning anything he could, and he only made it to the 3rd grade, but he loved to read, and he liked to think about theology and heaven and all these other grand ideas. Zula, I think the thing that she loved most about church was singing. She and Millie were a duet, and my dad said Zula was a natural alto. I don't think either one of them read music, but Millie knew the melody, and Zula could just hear how the alto part would go in there, which is kind of a cool thing. And it ended up that as time went on, there was pretty good cooperation among all the religions in Park City. I've looked at a lot of programs for funerals, and quite often the opening prayer is given by the Mormon bishop and the closing prayer by the Presbyterian or Congregationalist minister. Why not, right? And I think that's another good lesson we can learn. The last thing I'll talk about with relation to zoo is the Remington Company's ordnance plant that went in Salt Lake City in 1943, I think. That's what it's all gone now, but that became Salt Lake's first industrial area. This was one of 8 similar small arms plants nationwide that employed 80,000 people, 10,000 in each plant. The Utah plant made thousands of pistols and rifles and scabbards, and you won't believe this when I read it, more than 10 billion rounds of 30 and 50 caliber bullets. Not million, billion. They worked 3 shifts, so Zoo and her friends who carpooled had to show up for day, afternoon, or midnight shift, And I think there were 2 things going on here. One was this was the war and everybody was behind, getting in to do their part. And the other, it was a chance to earn some good money. Right? And these pictures are just amazing, just to think of that much lead being made to kill people. But the plant was closed in December of 1943 and placed on standby, having met its purpose as an interim facility. They built bigger and more effective, more efficient plants later on. But I got wondering what it was like to commute through Parley's Canyon in the 1940s. Okay, this picture's this picture's in 1939, I think. You can see the railroad was still there, right? Road wasn't paved. This is 1955 when they widened the road to 4 lanes and paved it. Okay, and some of you who drive that road often could probably identify where that is. It is from the mountains that are around it. And even after it was paved, it was still the scene of frequent accidents. It's funny, but it's not. So thank goodness for freeways, I guess, But the final thing I want to talk about is something that I found quite interesting. Zoo, whether she was in her religious phase or not, she wanted to be friends with everybody. And she had that attitude. Some of you will recognize this building. That's Heber Avenue. That's where the ladies of the night plied their trade. And that was right down at the bottom of the street where the Nelson family lived. And according to my dad, his mom made friends with most of these women because she made friends with everybody. And he told me that he started delivering the Park Record when he was 12 or 13. And on his route, there were 2 people in the houses on Heber Avenue that took the paper. And he'd take it there, and he said, about the second week, one of the ladies came out. She said, I know you. You're Tommy. You're Zula's boy. He said, yeah, I am. He says, your mom's a good lady. He says, I'm glad you're bringing us our paper. You do a good job, and I'll tip you a quarter every month. He says, but I want you to know, if I ever see you in one of these houses, I'm going to grab you by the neck and take you up to your mom. So what can you say, right? We've got a final picture by Buck McDonald there. And Sherry was just telling me that last night, the denizens of Heber Avenue. And there was another establishment, I think, over on the road to Deer Valley, right? Anyway, they did their cleaning and laundry on Sunday morning. And Zoo noticed that there were some of the local boys got on the hill up above them and were throwing rocks at these ladies. Now, Zoo wasn't a big gal. What was she, 5'1"? Maybe. Okay. But she had a huge personality. And she went up to those boys and told them she probably used some stronger language than I will, that they better get down off there and go to wherever they go to church on Sunday and get there, or she was going to take care of them. So and they told them they should be in Sunday school. So the mines closed down in the early 50s, all the mines, and Carl went to work in Lark, Lark's an hour and a half away by car, even now, right? Because I checked it on Google Maps. But so he would board over there during the week, come home on the weekends. Zula worked at the local laundry. What was it called? George and Irene Butler's City Laundry. I couldn't find a picture of it, but she was billed as a highly skilled spotter and presser, which was a real skill. But finally, it got just to be too much. They sold their house to their daughter and her husband, James Berry, and they moved to Salt Lake. Not to James Berry. Anyway. Okay. All right. So I knew that I wouldn't get everything right. But the other thing I didn't tell you is when they bought that house from the lady who owned it, she told them, I think they gave her $400 down, and she said, send me $25 every month when you're not on strike or laid off. And there was no contract, just a written agreement. So eventually, when they moved to Salt Lake, Zoo worked a number of places doing what she really liked, and that was interior decorating. She finally worked in the drapery department at ZCMI and just really enjoyed working there. And she was really in her element. We sometimes joke that if you gave Grandma Zoo a gift, you better make sure that you wanted to see it painted gold when you went to her house, because she loved that gold spray paint. It was just so beautiful. So I'm really grateful to Zula Nelson for two reasons. First, she insisted that my dad go to college. He told me that as he got near to being out of high school, he thought, I'm just going to work in the mines like all these other guys. That was in 1946, right? But she had sent him down to the music camp at BYU the previous summer. She told him he'd be going again and that he should go talk to the super at the Silver King. The super said, your mom came and saw me, Tommy. He said, you're going to go to BYU. He says, anytime you come back here to Park City and you want to work a shift, you can do it and I'll pay you. Okay. But as soon as I find out you're not in college, you don't have a job. So there's a man that did somebody a favor, right? My dad said if he was careful, he could come home for the weekend and work 4 shifts. You can see how you could do that, just put, blank between each one. But he said all of his roommates at BYU were returned missionaries, and they thought he was coming up to Park City and boozing and having a good time. He said, I never told them they were wrong. But he became a high school music teacher, and because of his mother's influence and her watching out for him, he did well. And she was that way with all her kids. The other thing I really appreciate Sue for is that she introduced me to my wife, who's sitting there tonight. And Judy worked in the drapery department with Zula. And I asked Judy out. She told me later that she only accepted because she didn't want to offend Zula. She thought I was kind of strange because I had long hair, But that was a real wonderful thing that she did for me, and I'm still glad of it. So I've been going on and on. That's all I have for you tonight. Any questions, comments, or complaints?